Thanks so much, Ben. Appreciate the invitation, and it's just a big treat to be with you all and to be a part of this day. I wanted to come and be here for the morning to hear what was being said, since I get the after lunch gig, which I know is just a lot of confidence from the organizers that I can keep you alive. I'll be doing cartwheels, and you'll still be awake. But I think as I was listening, I was thinking, what I have to present is actually very similar to what Dr. Kapik was presenting, but it's kind of like turning the problem just like a couple degrees, because I'm a sociologist, so we're talking about the same thing, but we're just kind of turning it and seeing a slightly different angle. I'm gonna take off my glasses because I'm at that age where nothing's working. So it's like I see you through this, but then when I look at this, I can't see. I always like to introduce myself in these kinds of settings as someone who is Anglican with a Southern Baptist background, and so you can think about how that all works. And I like to start with two pieces of the faith traditions that I find actually to be one of the most lovely, testimony and confession. So here's my testimony. 14 years ago, I converted. I invited the iPhone 4, known to die-hard Apple fans as the Jesus phone, into my life. I took the leap of faith and accepted the Jesus phone because I believed. I believed in its promise to improve my life and make managing my work and family more easy. And since then, I have been very faithful. I have texted, I have posted, I have played Candy Crush. I have streamed countless podcasts. I have spent years carefully curating my favorite stations on Pandora. And I am very, truly grateful for what my digital devices can do for me. They help me fashion a life that is more convenient, it's more efficient, and more pleasurable. But just as I know that Jesus transforms anyone who opens themselves up to his presence, I personally can testify to the curious ways in which the Jesus phone has transformed the patterns of my life and penetrated the habits and preoccupations of my mind and heart. And so here we go to confession. I have to admit, the influence of the Jesus phone on my life hasn't always been great. I don't like that I'm chronically vexed by my email inbox that keeps filling like some reverse form of quicksand. I'm not proud of the fact that I can be sitting in a meeting or having coffee with a friend, but my spirit is distracted. It's somewhere else. I'm thinking of that post or that message that I sent, and I'm wondering, did anyone notice? Is anyone giving me a thumbs up, right? My presence is uncommitted. And I'm troubled to find that instead of abiding in the true Jesus and letting Jesus abide in me, I'm becoming someone who abides in the digital, and the digital is starting to abide in me. Now, a big part of my problem is that I actually really like productivity. I really like efficiency. I love the feeling of getting things done. I'm sure none of you are like that. I just naturally multitask, right? So when I'm driving, I'm planning meeting agendas in my head. When I'm eating, I'm frantically reading. When I'm standing in the checkout line, Dr. Kapik mentioned this, right? I'm crushing through my emails, right? And when I have my Jesus phone and other devices at my side, I start feeling like multitasking. That's nothing. That's for mere mortals. Why multitask when I can hypertask? Instead of just doing more than one thing, let's see how much I can do simultaneously, to the max. Can I do laundry, listen to a podcast, text a friend, cook dinner all at the same time, and plan a class? And when I hit that hypertasking stride, I'm like the human Millennium Falcon. I am jumping into productivity hyperspace. It feels alive. It feels good. It feels powerful. Until it's not. You see, it all feels great when everyone and everything is cooperating and running on time. But when things take longer than I planned, or the schedule changes unexpectedly, I start to fall apart. I get frustrated, I get angry, I get impatient. And what do? I put on my blinders, I harden my heart, and I just steamroll whatever, whoever is in my way, because I am set on hypertasking. And after a long day of that, what happens? I come home, I'm completely depleted, I have headaches, my eyes are tired, and what do? I zone out on the couch, poking and swiping away at my screens, cycling through my social media and my texts, maybe more Candy Crush. I'm looking for refreshment, and usually it doesn't come. My brain is overtaxed, and now I'm just numb. I try to rest, but I'm restless. So I have all these signs telling me I wasn't meant to live this way. I've come to see there's an insidious lie at the root of my hypertasking. While I might be motivated out of a desire to be faithful to the gifts that God has given me, more often than not, what I'm actually doing is bowing down to the false gods of productivity. I've come to see that I've been training my body and my imagination according to a rather unsacred rule of life, a set of health habits and rhythms that originate not from a Christian monastic tradition, but one that emerged out of modern Western industrialization, a rule of life called time management. You see, Dr. Kapik and I, we're on the same page, we're just turning. I viewed time management as a way of life for so long that I tend to regard time as a limited resource that needs to be hoarded and strategically spent, rather than understanding that time is something I do not actually get to possess, that I only get to inhabit time. It is a gift of God. So why is time management so compelling, right? It feels compelling to so many of us because we live in a culture, this is the sociologist part, right? We live in a culture where commitment and passion are actually signaled by our willingness to optimize our productivity and to push it to the max. And now that we are digitally equipped with 24/7 access to information, to communication, the architecture of our lived experiences urges us to believe that we can and we should be productive all the time. We live in a time where not being productive is to be wasteful. It is to be lazy. It is to be disobedient. And all of these instincts are part of a story that our culture of productivity tells us about what it means to be human and what the good life is. And the story basically teaches us these things. 1, productivity is the ultimate good. 2, our worth and life's meaning is measured by how much we get done. 3, our lives are basically empty vessels, a string of 30-minute time blocks in our Google Calendar, like Dr. Kapik's student, right, that needs to be filled with meaningful accomplishments and tasks. 4, more is always better, even if more means less attention and care for the other human beings who don't happen to be on my calendar. And 5, when it's time to finally rest and play, ironically, these activities are only meaningful if they make me more productive in the long run. And if we sit with this story long enough, we realize that while being productive is surely a gratifying and wondrous part of being human, right? There's nothing wrong with being productive. But to live as if productivity were the ultimate good is to not be human, but to become like a machine. And that is not an accident. So I mentioned in passing that our modern notions of time management and productivity are born out of the Industrial Revolution, a civilizational development that on the one hand remarkably raised standards of living, right? Most of us are probably like, thank you, Lord, the Industrial Revolution happened, right? A lot of good things came out of that. Efficient manufacturing of goods, automation of services. On the other hand, it also began a process of systematically instrumentalizing human beings and the natural world, reducing us to mere means to given ends, usually market-driven ones. And for hundreds of years, industrialization has been dedicated to finding faster ways of producing goods and more effective ways to utilize labor. Factories have been designed as systems of control to serve the insatiable demands of optimization and efficiency. Assembly lines and employee management practices have long prescribed and monitored how long it should take to complete tasks. 19th century social theorist Max Weber observed that successful industries rely on principles of quantification, efficiency, and technological standardization. But he feared that these principles would leap the walls of commerce and become the dominant guide and measure of every aspect of our lives. And he feared that the entirety of our human existence would become subsumed by what he grimly called the iron cage of rationality. And today, I think when we look around, especially in the workplace, we see Weber's insight has been confirmed. Many of us are familiar with the tyranny of metrics. Many of us work in organizations and industries that evaluate success through quantification. How many more products are sold? How many more patients, clients, parishioners are coming? How many more clicks and downloads have been achieved? Are the test scores higher? And in order to know the answer to these questions of how many, what do we have to do? We spend a lot of our time at work dedicated to assessing and counting and keeping track and collecting data and recording so that it can be analyzed for performance review and organizational decisions about how to allocate resources. Our communication technologies like email, Slack, Google Calendar, these are all tools meant and do make our processes more efficient. And yet, we all know the mountainous burden of messages and communications we wade through day and night just to get anything done. And this is the phenomenon of that Weber had the insight to call the irrationality of rationality, right? Things actually start to go kind of sideways when you're trying to make things more efficient. And as we're all pounding away on our keyboards and feeling the demands of needing to produce more, what are the costs? The costs lie mainly in the realm of the relational. As the demands of industrialization increasingly frame how we offer our services, therapy, interventions, education, we are often burdened by these systems of data, assessment, and time constraints, often at the cost of granting our students, clients, patients the dignity we believe and know they deserve, and what is needed for establishing trust and rapport. And as workers, we anxiously live by the clock, partially distracted when meeting with these various clients and patients. We have no time to stop by our colleague's desk and say hello. We don't have time to ask about their loved one, hear their long story about some random happenstance. And we have little or no time for ourselves. We eat lunch at our desk. It's harder and harder to take a break because each time we do, we come back and there's 20 more emails. We're constantly digging ourselves out of a relentless to-do list. It is like that I Love Lucy episode in the Chocolate Factory, but on a deep existential level. And part of what has accelerated the industrializing tendencies of our workplace is the fact that so much of our workplace interactions are now mediated by digital technologies that are designed and rooted in a modernist disregard for the fact that we are actually embodied people who bring physical presence and voice to our embodied interactions, and that other people's physical presence and human voice impinges upon us when we are in the same room. MIT psychologist Sherry Turkle has long studied how a generation of young people, now millennials in your workplace, have come to prefer texting over face-to-face and voice-based interactions. Her conclusion is that texting becomes preferred because it gives us the ability to control and dial down other people's access to us. In comparison to this fairly narrow band of communication that texting affords, when we are face-to-face, It is rich with nonverbal cues. Even the phone conversation is full of tones, pauses. And now those things, being in person, phone, that just feels too taxing, too much energy, too many things to have to process. There's too much unpredictability built into voice or face-to-face contexts that include all those awkward silences, the uncertainty of what flashes across someone's face in a fraction of a second, the delicate negotiating of dull conversations, the fumbling for right words. It's just too inefficient. It takes too much work to deal with. So we just go text or email, just get it done. And our digital platforms have made it easy to give ourselves permission to downshift in this way to our lesser selves. The lesser selves who want to assert control and not have to deal with the awkward humanity of other people and allow us to avoid the risk of being found out that we too are awkward people. And the industrializing drives of our workplace are amplified by these technologies that seem to make things more productive. But what's interesting is we all read about the increasing rates of workplace burnout as a signal that something is not quite right. Something is not scaled and scoped appropriately to the humans who are doing the work in these systems. In the wake of the recent pandemic years, the trends of burnout have been notable, and scholars are really starting to try to reconsider where burnout comes from, right? Most of us think that burnout is just people having too much work that's outstripping their internal resources. And then there's this one argument that I find really interesting. It argues that burnout may actually be comes from this chronic dissonance that people feel in their jobs. They feel this dissonance because they're in jobs where they feel like they should have space and capacity to connect and relate to the people they're seeking to serve and address. But they're working in systems that are so industrialized around numbers, spreadsheets, digital platforms, that they're feeling constantly thwarted by the need to tend to those demands over and above sitting down, being present, being a human person alongside another human. That people are just feeling frustrated and they can't get to doing the work that they actually were called to do, that they entered into that career to do, right? And so many of us who work in organizations and industries that are ruled by this tyranny of metrics knows that so much of the time we feel like our humanity is having to be curtailed, tucked, shoved into a certain shape or a box to fit the system of productivity that our workplace requires. We are trained to be transactional with each other, which has its benefits, not only in efficiency, but often in matters of fairness and equity. But there is usually little or no encouragement in many workplaces to value the profound encounter that can happen when two human beings recognize each other as sacred and inherently valuable. And I think it's in this way, right, in this industrializing logic, that we are expected to function more and more like machines. Which is why it becomes easier and easier to imagine AI taking over jobs in counseling, teaching, and healthcare. Right? What should be astonishing to us is not so much that artificial intelligence is getting better at mimicking the human. What should be astonishing to us is how much we as human beings are allowing ourselves to function like machines. So where is the good news? I've given us a lot of bad news. That's why I love being a sociologist. I am the purveyor of bad news. Where's the good news? Where's the gospel truth? How does the gospel truth speak into these perplexing realities? I'm going to reach back to 1978, Richard Foster. He wrote, "In contemporary society, our adversary, the devil, majors in three things: noise, hurry, and crowds. If he can keep us engaged in muchness and manyness, he will rest satisfied. Today, we live in a digitally saturated world that specializes in noise, hurry, and crowds. Our digital lives are structured to encourage us to think that muchness and manyness is a sign of success and worth. And Foster's comment forces the question, well, is the adversary resting satisfied when he looks at my life? Many of us in this room have trained long and hard in the habits of productivity. So much so that right after this session, our bodies will instinctively reach to our phones to find out what's happened, and our minds will break from where we are now and surveil the horizon of our messages to see if our attention needs to be summoned elsewhere. And so I think the challenge for us is, how do we live the lives that we have to live, but retrain them? Retrain our bodies, retrain our imaginations to become people who live not for the sake of being productive, but who live to love God and be grounded in God's estimation of our worth and who we are. How do we become people who live not to be productive, but to become people who live to love our neighbor and be open to the unexpected grace found in encountering their presence? So first, we need a new story, right? There's a story, the ruthless story of our culture that our culture of productivity tells us. We need a counter story, right? A counter story of what it means to be human. And instead of the productivity story of scarcity, fear, control, we need a story of abundance, of presence, and freedom. We need a counter story like the one found in the Gospel of Mark. It's a familiar one to many of you, but let's try to hear it with new ears to sing a new song in the face of our culture's idolatry of productivity. So here's the story. Jesus arrives on the shore. There's a synagogue leader, Jairus, seeking him out, begging him to come and heal his dying daughter. Jesus says, okay. He's on his way to the house. He's interrupted by this unnamed woman whose physical suffering has been long uncured. She's been bleeding for many years and is now socially cast to the side as one who is considered unclean. Pressed in by this large crowd who's hungry for the spectacle of seeing what Jesus will do for this local celebrity family, Jesus stops. Jesus stops at the very real cost of risking the daughter's life. Jesus stops for this nameless woman who interrupts the parade. Jesus stops, even in the face of the wild desperation of a father whose heart is breaking with every passing second. And what does Jesus do? He stops, heals, and blesses. He foregrounds a no one, an unnamed woman perceived as a mere interruption by her contemporaries, and raises her up as a model of genuine courage and faith that we all still talk about today. And here we have a story where Jesus is not practical, Jesus is not efficient. Jesus is taking a huge risk by letting himself be interrupted by someone who everyone regards as a no one. Why? How? How do we do this? What does Jesus do, right? Jesus is so grounded in his Father's love that he can refuse the temptation to be reduced to a crowd-pleasing miracle machine, but lives into the more surprising and complicated nature of his full authority, the capacity to forgive sin, to bless, to restore people to community. That's way more complicated than a miracle, right? He is so grounded in his love for his neighbor that he can shift his entire focus from one very legitimate need to another very legitimate need. How might we follow this way of Jesus? How can we retrain our bodies to live more like him? As a community of faith, how can we encourage each other to disrupt and resist the lies of productivity and the secular liturgies of our digital devices that we continually bury ourselves into, seeking some kind of time salvation, right? How can we open ourselves up to something new, a new song? So what I want to suggest in closing is that maybe we can try a simple practice that pushes back and resists these ways of productivity. So instead of multitasking, what if we experimented from time to time with monotasking? It is what it sounds like. When you're doing one thing, you only do that one thing. So, a couple examples. When you happen to be eating on your own, what would it be like to just eat? Just eating. Taste the food. Look around you. Where am I actually? Like, what would that be like? When you're driving, no podcasts, no phone calls, no music. You just drive. And this is for the very advanced. When you are waiting, checkout line, doctor's office, we're getting more advanced. Doctor's office, airport. What would it be like to just wait? Now, why are we doing this? This is not about virtue. This is not to prove that I am some holy being, right? This is not some like exercise of strength. We do this to find out what happens. We do this to realize, okay, how's this feeling? Am I breaking out into a cold sweat? Am I fidgety? Am I feeling very ungrounded? What's happening in the silence? What's happening in the stillness? What's happening in the solitude? What do we discover about ourselves? What do we actually notice around us? The people that are standing in line, right? The food that I'm eating, the neighborhoods I'm driving by. What do I actually discover the Holy Spirit has been inviting me to that I have been running from because I'm actually still for a moment? It's about finding out what's going to happen. And maybe some of us are like, freedom, this is awesome. I'm finally resting. And that's wonderful, right? It's all about experimenting, right? And discovering, is there something I'm actually missing when I'm running so hard to get things done? In our culture of productivity, of noise, hurry, and crowds, monotasking can function as a spiritual discipline that presses us to confront the hard but necessary questions. Can I trust that what God desires in us, desires in me, is not how productive I can be or how much good I can do in the world, but rather God desires my presence, my allowing myself to be still in the loving arms of our Lord? Can I trust that ultimately God longs to love me, to weep over me, and to pour healing life into me so that I can be free from the iron cage of my life and all of us collectively? Like, can we trust God's true intent and desire for us? May we have the courage to consider how we can retrain our bodies and our imaginations to live into this counter story of Jesus. Thank you.